Here, on my yellow couch, you can see the first three volumes of Buddha by Osamu Tezuka, which I got out of my school library. Now, if you're familiar with this series, no doubt you know that there are actually 8 volumes in the series. I only checked out the first 3 volumes to begin with, partly because I wasn't quite sure how many books you can check out at my school library, and I was a little worried about getting shamed at the checkout desk by being asked to return some of those books to the shelves. It's happened to me in the past at different libraries. Partly because I didn't want to look greedy, and partly because I was, just the logistics of carrying around 8 volumes. I wasn't quite sure how I would juggle them in my hands or get them home in one bag. Each volume is a little bit chunky. So what I did is I thought, well, I'll check out the first 3 volumes, and then I'll come back for volumes 4 and 5 and 6, 7, and 8 as I work my way through this series. And hopefully nobody will check out those other volumes while I'm in the middle of reading this. I'm hoping that everybody knows that you need to start at volume 1, so nobody will check out volume 4 while I still have volume 1, 2, and 3 out. That's not a guarantee, because sometimes people will pick up these books on impulse without really checking to see whether they're part of a series. So I guess I'm kind of taking my chances here, but my intent is to work through this series. And what I was thinking about doing is just filming a review for each volume as I go. Even though the all 8 books are really just one continuous story that's just split up into different volumes for ease of bindings and that kind of logistical stuff. But I was thinking it would kind of help me to keep track of my thoughts if I just recorded my thoughts after reading each volume. Also, volume 1, which I've finished now. I haven't yet done volumes 2 and 3, but I have finished volume 1, and there is a definite story arc which does come to the end at volume 1. So perhaps each volume here has even though they're all one continuing story, they do have mini arcs which conclude in each volume. We'll see if that stays true for the following volumes. Hopefully I don't run out of things to talk about as I'm doing videos for each one. And apologies in advance to people who are subscribed to this channel. It seems like I'm spamming you with videos, but I think that's the route I'm going to go down. So, going to talk briefly about or maybe not so briefly, going to talk at some length about my history with Tezuka Osamu, or Osamu Tezuka, and the Buddha book, and then get into my thoughts on volume 1. So if you've watched this channel before, you know that when I give a review, I frequently mix in my personal reminiscences or my own history with the franchise being reviewed. It's not purely a factual review. There's a fair amount of self-indulgence on this channel. If that's not for you, consider yourself warned that this might be a good point to find a different video. But my own history with this is I first encountered Tezuka Osamu when I lived in Japan. I went to Japan to teach English in 2001, and I lived there for 8 years following. And when I arrived in Japan, I didn't really know much about manga or anime. And I think, when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, it wasn't quite mainstream yet, the way it would become in subsequent years for the kids coming up behind me. It was definitely out there. I had friends who were into it in college. There was an anime club at my college. It was beginning to be mainstreamed, but it was still a little bit out there on the fringes. Now, if you watch this channel, I'm a huge geek. Uh, that should be fairly evident. But I've largely been someone who's interested in the mainstream geeky stuff. Star Trek, DC Comics, things that are not things that are right there in the cultural mainstream. Anime seemed a little bit weird and exotic, and manga. And I never really got into that when I was younger. But then I went to Japan, and you, when in Rome, you have to do what the Romans do, right? When in Japan, you have to kind of get into the local the local culture, or the local comics. Now, I was spent most of my time in Japan in small rural towns where there weren't any English bookstores. So I was exposed. I the local comic books were kind of the only entertainment available, or the only reading available for a large part. Um, I did get some books on Japan and on Japanese when I was studying there. And some of those books mentioned Osamu Tezuka, or Tezuka Osamu, as he's known in Japan, because in Japan you would reverse the names. The family name would go first in Japanese. If you're not familiar with him, well, these books I was reading said he was the Walt Disney of Japan, which I think it is true in a couple of ways. Uh, One way he's considered the Walt Disney of Japan is he was definitely very influenced by Disney animation. So he when he was a young man, he was watching Disney cartoons and modeled his drawing on the Disney style. And you can see that here, just flipping randomly through this book. I mean, it's not exactly Disney. It's a little bit different, but it's definitely kind of Disney-esque, isn't it? Yeah, actually, let me see if I can find a good panel here. This book especially is reminiscent of Disney, because it's one of those books where all the animal friends come out, and these scenes where they're interacting with the animals reminds you of Disney's Snow White or something like that. The other way he's equivalent to maybe Walt Disney is as he became more and more successful, he had like this huge animation empire in Japan. I don't really know this in detail, but I've been told by Japanese friends that after he became really huge, he wasn't actually drawing all these panels himself. I mean, the output of manga he produced was just so huge that it was like an assembly line process. He would do the rough sketches, but he had a whole team that was refining these pictures for him. He also, I believe, got into animation on television and had an animation studio, yeah, was just absolutely huge in Japan back in his day. And his day was, I think his heyday was like the 60s and 70s. I forget when he started. It started in the 40s and 50s. And then he died relatively young in the 80s, I believe, of stomach cancer. I had a Japanese friend who theorized that he got the stomach cancer because he never sat down properly to eat a meal. He was just always eating sandwiches, or onigiris, the Japanese rice sandwiches, while he was working. I don't know if that's true or not, but just repeating things I've heard at this point. So once I started hearing about him, I was intrigued. The stuff I was reading about him said that he, although he was hugely popular, he was also getting into some mature or adult themes, that like political stuff, religious stuff was in a lot of his work. Um, also, yeah, I guess I was just intrigued by his iconic status in Japan. Like I said, I've always been attracted to the mainstream stuff, the classics, and he was definitely um, the classic guy in Japanese manga, Japanese comic books. When I lived in Japan, and this was 20 years ago now, but I suspect this might still be true. His stuff was all over. So you go into any bookstore, and you could buy you would see rows of his comic books. And one of the great things about Japan, again, when I lived there, assuming this is still true, is comics were really cheap to buy. You know, coming from the US, where if you wanted to buy like a bound comic book collection, it would cost you like $15 or $20. In Japan, it would be like $2 or $3. And granted, that's partly because nothing was in color. But you know, in the U.S., even black and white collections of comics, I recall as a kid paying like $15 for like a collection of Dick Tracy comics, which was all black and white. But you just pay such a huge price for comics in the U.S. Um, yeah, in Japan, it was cheap in the bookstores, and then there were so many used comics stores where these collections would be resold, and yeah, you could get them so cheap. So I would buy a lot of the just on impulse. Um, and I started off buying it when I only could read a little Japanese, because I arrived in Japan with no Japanese, and gradually picked it up while I was there. And As I was able to read more and more Japanese, I started getting more and more Tezuka Osamu comics. I never got to the point where I could read it fluently. Like there were always some words I didn't understand. It was always a little bit of a struggle to decode. But I did get to the point where I could kind of make sense of it. And of course, the great thing about comics is it's such a visual medium that the pictures are largely telling the story, and any words that you can pick up are largely a bonus. So if there's, okay, that's overstating it, obviously, but there could be a word or a whole sentence that I wouldn't understand, and I was still able largely to understand what was happening because of the pictures and because of the words I did understand. It's because of this experience in Japan that I'm a big advocate of using comic books to learn second languages. And now that I'm teaching English in Japan, I encourage my students to read as many English comics as they can. And fortunately, our library does have a collection. Sorry, I'm going on a digression. Uh, I, I would pick up lots of Tezuka Osamu comics. Sometimes, like I said, I was living in a small town where there wasn't a lot to do. Sometimes I'd just wander these secondhand comic book stores and just pick up stuff because I was bored and flip through it. When I lived there, there was a Tezuka Osamu magazine collection, which came out every month in the convenience stores, in addition to all the other stuff of his that was in print. It was, it was all reprints of his stuff because he was long dead by that time, and it was like a big magazine and thick like this, which would have various reprints of his stories, and I used to get that every month and pick up what I could. Um, Now, the thing about Tezuka Osamu is some of it could be a bit weird. And when I say weird, take me with a grain of salt because I mean, I mean from an American perspective, right? So whenever you read something from a different culture, there are things that are going to seem weird or strange to you. And I don't mean to sound close minded about this. Like, I'm not saying it's bad, but it's different. Some of it rubs you the wrong way or it requires an adjustment. Some of the stuff with Tezuka Osamu, and I was reminded of this as I was rereading this, is there's often a disconnect between the very cartoony style and some of the very dark storylines he'll sometimes get into. And actually, maybe I should back up a step here and say that his work really ran the gamut. He's got some stuff which is aimed at very little kids, very simplistic stuff. But then he's got some stuff which is aimed at older kids or adults, which is, getting into. Yeah, I remember when I used to pick up his stuff, there was some of his stuff I could read it so easily because it was aimed at kids. And there was some of his stuff, he had this whole cartoon about this medical doctor. And there was so much medical terminology in it. I really had such a hard time deciphering what was going on. I was largely just looking at the pictures and picking up a word here or there. So there's the dark or adult themes contrasted with the cartoony style. There were also times when it seems like he was getting needlessly dark or needlessly morbid when he didn't need to be, or where the story would seem to take a rather sharp turn into a dark corner with really no reason. Stuff that would seem to be an American audience strange. I don't know how a Japanese person would critique it. It could. There was depictions of sexual stuff in some of his books. Rape would be depicted in some of his stories, not graphically, but it was definitely portrayed or alluded to. And as long as I'm getting into this, there were some animated depictions of women, which were meant to be sexually arousing. And this is a factor in Japanese manga, and it seems to be much more accepted in Japanese media than it is in American media. It's one of those interesting contradictions in culture. I heard somebody say on a travel show once that every culture is a study in contradictions, because you're always comparing it from the standpoint of your own culture, which makes everything else seem strange and contradictory when you look at another culture, if that makes sense. From an American standpoint, one of the interesting contradictions it would seem in Japanese culture is that, I'm going to get into generalizations here, which is always dangerous, but as a generalization, Japanese women are much more shy and modest than their Western counterparts. But Japanese media is much more comfortable with displaying nudity and sexualization of women, especially in an animated form. And there would be some of that in Tezuka Osamu's work. Now, I suppose you're wondering, why am I going on about this? Well, I feel like I kind of have to, because it's in this book. There's a lot of bare female breasts which are shown in this book, and I'm not even sure if I'm allowed to show those images on YouTube. I might get. I mean, it's not blatant. It's not particularly sexual, but given what YouTube community guidelines are, who knows what you can get in trouble for. I'm reluctant to zoom up on it here, but just trust me, it's in here. All the women are bare-breasted, and I suspect that's partly because maybe Osamu Tezuka was under the impression that was the historical dress of women in India at that time, and maybe he's right. But it's a kind of thing that would maybe not be shown in the equivalent of a Western comic. And again, keep in mind that this is very mainstream stuff in Japan. And in fact, I was even reading on Wikipedia that this comic book collection after it was printed, was quite popular in Buddhist youth centers and as a way to teach about Buddhism to children. And I was thinking, well, if you were doing the equivalent for Christianity and producing a comic book series about the life of Christ, you would not have like a lot of bare-breasted women in that. Not to mention there are some depictions of male anatomy, not in any great detail. There's a couple scenes where characters are peeing on each other as a way to show disrespect. That stuff would not be that stuff would not be in the Christian equivalent of this. But so it strikes me as different cultures, different tastes. But anyways, to get back into my history of this, at one point when I was in Japan, I think this was after about 3 years of living there, I was in a used bookstore and I came across, in Japanese, in a box set in a used bookstore, the complete collection, all 8 volumes of Buddha by Tezuka Osamu, and bought it up quite cheaply. I paid the equivalent of $5 or $10 for it, and was quite happy to have stumbled upon it. Now, I should maybe go off on a different tangent here and say that I really knew nothing or next to nothing about the story of Buddha before I arrived in Japan. I mean, I knew the basics, right? Like he was raised with a wealthy family. His father tried to shield him from the miseries of the world. He goes outside for the first time and he says, "Why is that man so old?" And that's when he first, the basic bare bones story of Buddha I knew. But I was also vaguely aware that there was a much richer mythology about Buddha that had developed, and I was vaguely interested in this stuff. I was huge into Greek mythology when I was younger. I was a big fan of the Old Testament growing up in my Christian church. So I thought when I arrived in Japan, I thought I would love to get into Buddhist mythology and hear those stories. And I was kind of hoping to find the handbook of Buddhist mythology, just like you would find like an introduction to Greek mythology. But I don't know if that book exists out there somewhere, but I never found it. I suspect maybe this is because there's no canon of Buddhist mythology the way there is like a canon of Christian Old Testament or Greek mythology. There's certainly a lot of stories that have developed over the centuries is my impression. I don't know, I'm getting ahead of myself. The point is I was interested in Buddhist mythology but never quite found the introductory book I was looking for until I stumbled across this, and I thought, great. I can practice my Japanese. I can read Tezuka Osamu, whose stuff I had been reading a lot of at that time, and I can learn the story of Buddhist mythology. So I started reading this book in Japanese. It was about 20 years ago now, but I can still remember parts of it. This is the English translation I'm showing you here on camera, but I had the Japanese one. And as usual, I wasn't able to understand every word, but I could largely follow the story and could largely make sense of it through some effort. And I remember just being initially engrossed in this. So I had been curious to find out the story of Buddha. And as I was reading along, I was more and more fascinated with just how complex this story was. I mean, we start off with this monk who's looking for a child who's rumored to be gifted. So we're on the monk's adventures, and then we That's Monk's story intertwines with the story about a slave and his mother, and then their story intertwines with the story of this young child who has this magical ability to take possession of animal bodies. So then all of their stories are being intertwined, and then there's this army that comes marching in to destroy the village with this general. And so now his story is intertwined, and all of these intersecting characters and story arcs. And I was thinking, wow. And you know, we haven't even gotten to the birth of Buddha at this point. And I thought I had no idea that this mythology was so rich in characters and story. And then gradually I began to suspect that this was not the mythology at all. That this was Tezuka Osamu was making this all up. Now, at this time, 20 years ago, it was a lot harder to fact check this on the internet than it is now. I know this is hard to remember a time before Wikipedia, but there was no Wikipedia back in 2003. You know, it was there was the internet, but it was not as rich as it is now, and it was difficult to check this stuff. Of course, you go on Wikipedia now, and Wikipedia will tell you exactly who's a fictional character and who is a real character. Real, I guess, in this sense, mean relating to the older mythology, the real mythology. And yeah, pretty much all of these characters were as I suspected, as I eventually began to suspect. Just Tezuka Osamu's own story, which he's made up to go alongside the story of Buddha, which does begin to unfold later in the book. So, I mean, this volume 1 does also cover the birth of Buddha, but that story is alongside Tezuka Osamu's own story. It strikes me, maybe, I guess, if we're looking for an equivalent in Christian literature, maybe the equivalent of Ben-Hur, where, you know, Ben-Hur is not related to the original Christian mythology, but it's a novel about characters which is taking place parallel and alongside of the Jesus story. I'm still in volume 1, so we'll see how this develops, but I suspect that's what's going on here. I actually never quite finished volume 1. I got about, I don't know, little over halfway through, and then I just lost interest in it. Part of it is because I began to realize that this actually was not the real Buddha story, and that took away some of the reason I had for reading it. The other part is, you know, it was just hard work reading through something in a foreign language. And Japanese, if you're at all familiar with the Japanese writing system, you know that's not the easiest reading and writing system for a foreigner to become proficient in. So my interest just petered out, and I never did finish the first volume, let alone all 8 volumes. But shortly after that, I was back in the US visiting for Christmas and visiting my local bookstore, and I saw that these books were being sold in America in English. You know, this is one of those weird things about the universe lining up. Right about the same time I was discovering these books in Japan was about the same time they had been translated into English. Now, they had been in Japan, I think they were written in Japan throughout the late 70s and early 80s. I think, according to Wikipedia, this was Tezuka Osamu's last big epic, or one of his last big epics, I don't remember. But didn't get their English translation until around 2003, 2004. So when I discovered that these were being sold in the bookstores in America, I was both quite excited and a little bit upset. Now, this is one of those irrational human emotions, but it is this human emotion. I had felt a little bit special reading this in Japanese, like I was unlocking some part of Japanese culture which most Americans don't get access to, or most Americans don't get to read. Uh, Even though I never finished it, that was the feeling I had while I was reading it at the time. And then I came back and it was right there on the bookstores in English. And I bought a copy to give to a friend as a Christmas gift. I thought that would be neat. I gave it to my family, not a friend. Gave it to my family. I thought it would be a neat thing for them to see in English some of the stuff I had been reading in Japanese. And I remember the woman at the bookstore said, "Oh, right. Yes, this has been a very popular book. A lot of people have been really enjoying this." And I thought, oh, I mean, it's a classic hipster thing, isn't it? Like, I liked this thing before it was popular. But for whatever it's worth, I had gotten into this, I don't know, maybe a year or 6 months before it got popular, before it got translated into English. But yeah, just never did read the English translation. And, of course, if you buy these in America, it's much more expensive than buying in Japan. Yeah, look at this. $15. This would have been like, buy this at a used bookstore in Japan for, like $5 for the whole set. I don't know why comics are so much cheaper in Japan than they are in America. But they are. At least they were when I lived there. So, sorry, that's my long backstory with this series. What time is it? Been filming for 30 minutes and haven't even gotten into my review. Okay, so 20 years later, I'm coming back to this series, picking it up, and reading through the first book. Actually, I think as I've been rambling along, I have been giving a lot of my thoughts about what I wanted to say in this story. It's kind of a strange story, but it's interesting. There's a lot of different stuff going on, and you're wondering, okay, how is this all going to come together? How is this connected with Buddha? Now, while this is going on, there's a story happening that's going on parallel to this. At this point in the series, pretty unconnected to our main story, but about the mother and father of Buddha, and about Buddha's miraculous birth. Now, having grown up a Christian, I immediately realized how similar the miraculous birth of Buddha seems to be to the miraculous birth of Christ. I mean, the stories aren't exactly the same, but the general vibe of a destined child who's born, and there are all these signs from heaven, and all these great prophets come over to recognize what a great child this will be, and how he will be the salvation of the world. All of that stuff is there. So it's I don't know. Make of that what you will. As I've grown older and I've since left the Christian faith, the agnostic part of me is inclined to say, well, it just goes to show how there's nothing special about the Christian story, how these are just common archetypes in all religion. But I'm aware there are different interpretations you could have. I think the Christian response to this might be that this is just how would they phrase it? Different religions have some sort of access to the true faith, and even though they don't know the Christ story, they're emulating it imperfectly, or something like that. They could explain it much better. Um, so I talked a little bit before about the depiction of female characters. One thing I didn't mention, in addition to displaying them topless, they also seemed in this particular story to all look the same. So, yeah, I mean, this is the mother of Shapra, and this is the girlfriend of Shapra. And don't these two characters look exactly the same? Like, if it wasn't for the various context or the dialogue cues, I couldn't tell which one was which. They seem to me to have the same depictions of the same character. That I don't think that's always true in Tezuka Osamu's work. I'm trying to remember the stuff I used to read 20 years ago. Certainly the male characters are very easy to distinguish. They each have their own look. There are some dark turns in this book, like I mentioned that Tezuka Osamu has a tendency to do. So there is a lot of tragedy mixed in here. I was reminded when I was reading this about the feeling that I often had reading Tezuka Osamu, is that the dark turns of the tragedy would also often seem to come out of nowhere. And I had that feeling again when I was reading this. It had been something I had forgotten about over the years, but started to remember again as I read this book. Yeah. I'm trying to think, what else did I want to say? Maybe I've said everything I want to say for the present. It is a very readable book, and you can see here how visually appealing it is, and even though this is a massive series with 8 rather substantial volumes, rather thick volumes, each individual page is not too heavy on the text. They're largely very visual and very picturesque. Very lots of pictures here, and there is dialogue, but it's not very text heavy. Yeah, maybe I'll just leave it off there. Those are my initial thoughts on Volume 1. As I continue on with Volume 2 and 3, I'll record additional thoughts as I go. Sorry in advance for spamming the subscriber feed on this channel. And I'll try and, I think I'm going to return this one to the library tomorrow and try and pick up more volumes as soon as I can to make sure that nobody checks any of the others out before I'm finished reading them. So yeah, I'll be continuing to review this volume by volume, and then maybe give a final video at the end. We'll see how it goes.